Today we're going to talk about the disorganized, historically called, or fearful avoidant, fearful attachment pattern. I'm a licensed psychologist. I love attachment theory, but I don't love the way it's often demonized and the styles are judged, and we don't really have compassion or understanding for the deep nuances of where these patterns start. So I like to talk about these in terms of the colors. I'll talk more about this in the course I'm creating on creating your own attachment manual to understand yourself, your body, your relationships, your core wounds, your core beliefs, all of that kind of stuff. But I like to think about it in terms of colors, where blue is the more avoidant, green is more secure, red is more anxious, and purple, for me, is more disorganized. And these ideas were inspired from a podcast called Therapist Uncensored, which I highly recommend. Okay, so in this style, this is where it gets interesting. So at the core, we have conflicting dynamics. We have avoidant behaviors, we have anxious behaviors, we have fearful driven behaviors. And when the first research was done, this was what was the could not classify group of babies, where they just decided, well, I don't know what this is, I'm going to put this away. And years later, it was kind of created, this style was created, and this group formed called Disorganized. Don't forget that attachment is about the responsiveness of the caregiver. And then what the research was showing, that like the patterns of how the kids responded. And the reason why I keep saying patterns is that I really believe that it's just to black and white the issue, right or wrong, doesn't allow for the nuance that I can have a parent who might have anxious qualities and avoidant qualities, and they aren't necessarily disorganized, right? So, and in myself, I know firsthand that I don't fit in the classic high-end of, clinical disorganization for patients who often have undiagnosed or clinical or diagnosed borderline, more extreme disorders, bipolar, things like that. But I do have both anxious and avoidant patterns in relationships. And you add in being an introvert, an only child, like all these things that can look one way, but also present a different way. So I can be like anxious. Do they like me? What does this mean? And I can also be, I want to be completely alone. I'm done. I can't handle this. It's too much. Things like that, historically, when I'm not working on it or aware of it, right? So basically, the main issue here is the contradictory attachment behaviors in the kids. So clinically, we're talking about kids who didn't have what initially was thought of as disorganization in their behavior. It was chaotic. And then later there have been some theories saying, no, there is organization to the chaos. But basically, we just couldn't decide. Like, they did some things that were this way and some that were that way. But the heart of this style in the very classic clinical dynamic would be caregivers who were two things. The caregiver was the source of safety, was also the source of fear. Meaning that the very same parent who was supposed to be your attachment figure was also potentially the most dangerous or emotionally unsafe person or physically unsafe person, all of the above, for a child. And that is the heart of it, is that trying to figure out, okay, this person is my fearful, the person I need to be most afraid of, and also is going to take care of me, is such a dilemma for a child. And that is the problem. And so what we know is the research showed that, what kind of mothers does this come from? These were often kids who had prolonged separations from their caregivers. So they were maybe removed from the home, or the parent left for a while, or they were shuffled to relatives. These babies often had mothers. So we're talking about primary caregivers in the research, but it could be anyone. But in this particular group, the mothers had more tendencies to have alcoholism, substance abuse, depression, mental illness. The parents were both frightened and frightening. So the parent could kind of be, if you're looking at a classic parent who's really struggling with mental health, they could be frightened and then frightening and scary and ragey. They could be loud and loom large and yell in the child's face. Other times they could be really fearful and tentative and confused. And so the biggest issue here, though, is that the source of security is also the source of fear. So think about what a dilemma that is, right? If the person who's supposed to feed you and care for you is also your greatest source of fear, and you have to choose, you're going to choose the attachment and tolerate the fear and live with it, because you cannot survive on your own. And that is the disorganization inside. Like, I'm going towards the fear, away from the fear, towards security, away from security. That's kind of how it plays out in the babies. It's often called fear without solution. So we're terrified, but where are we going to go? That's what I'm saying, right? So this is one of the biggest issues here, and we'll see a lot of parental dissociation, a lot of parental unresolved states of trauma, And when you're in traumatic states or you're dissociated, it makes it really difficult to attune to your children, right? To mirror them, to create a safe space for them if you are so disorganized really inside. So some more of the research shows that these moms had more intrusive and negative communications with their infants. They were sometimes hostile and aggressive and sometimes helpless and confused towards their infants. There was once again like an anxious attachment, too much involvement in the parent's state of mind. There could be role reversals, so a lot of like expecting the child to be the parent or the therapist, the best friend. Extreme misattunement and disrupted emotional communication. These parental failures result in the child's inability to maintain closeness, safety, or comfort and security from the caregiver. And so these babies had a greater negative emotional arousal. So a lot more crying and agitation and fear and things like that. We see a poor capacity for self-regulation in both the parents often and the child. We see these inhibited play. So remember, going back to secure attachment, that the ability to explore is that the idea that the more securely attached you are, the more you can explore the world. And so if you have this chaos inside, you're much less likely to do so, to explore. A lot of explosiveness and anger and helpless states in the infants, and a lot of difficulty with their own sense of self-development, who they are. And you can see why, because the child is really experiencing this frightening and frightened behavior. The parent is really just consistently, at the end of the day, they are not responsively safe. You can be the kindest, most loving parent today, but if tomorrow I am in total fear of you, and I mean real fear and danger, that is the template I'm going to use to see who you are. You don't get to keep the safe state, even though you might have, that's why I said parts of you could be safe and loving. The more underlying issue is you're not safe, and I have to operate with hypervigilance, over-focusing on the state of mind, just like an anxious attachment. We can see some compulsive caretaking here, especially if there was a role reversal, like parentification or enmeshment. And the tendency is to sort of have our own issues around hyperactivation and deactivation ourselves, right? So we are seeing this play out. And I really believe that for this style, I use the word disorganized to describe even someone like me, who I don't see myself as cognitively disorganized or even mentally in terms of like mental illness. But I do have contradicting behaviors, which I absolutely know are a result of having two parents with extreme rage issues who could be charming and loving and wonderful and also extremely unsafe and unpredictable, especially as we talk about disorders like borderline, narcissism, bipolar, things like that, depression. So as a child, I was always trying to kind of just calculate where they were and therefore where I was going to be. And that meant sometimes being in, traumatic situations with parents who were in their own state of unresolved trauma or rage or loss or panic or whatever, and not really having anyone safe to help me manage that and learning to manage it myself. So that's the combination of hypervigilance, I need to pay attention to them, but also learning that no one's coming to save you. You have to solve this on your own. So, like I say, with all of the attachment patterns, that all of these give us something, and I hate the idea of using the word resilience as like a plus, but I will say that, like, what else are you going to say? There are things that are required of us in childhood that do become qualities which help us survive in our adult lives. And it's unfortunate how we develop those things, but I don't want to always just say these are all bad, that no matter where you are on the spectrum, let's say, of your attachment pattern, that you're doing, the best you can to survive. And it's important to remember that. And I appreciate that I can be a very attentive, caregiver and not my parents, but also I can be alone, right? So it's like, don't forget to highlight and reinforce the parts that feel good and not to just turn around and shame yourself for the things that you had absolutely no control over in childhood. The difference is, hopefully today, you're finding ways to make those changes, and that's all you can do. That's all you can do. So I hope this gave you a flavor for understanding where this comes from and what it looks like. That's my goal here as I keep working towards understanding, helping us all understand, including myself, the relationship between relational trauma and our attachment experiences, our wounds. This is really attachment trauma, right? Having these repeated emotional, relational dynamics that shape who we are, not just in childhood, but for the course of our lives. And until we become aware and enlightened and start to do the work, we don't even necessarily know that's what's going on with us, but it's just part of our adaptability that we had to survive. And so I always want to reinforce that you survived it and you're here, and all you can do is take one day at a time. So thank you for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.